Okay, hello. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name's Anna Ramich. I am the Vice President and Chief of Staff at the American Academy in Berlin. Thank you all so much for joining us here this Tuesday evening. You're here tonight for the Gerhard Kasper lecture called Traditional Jewish Literature and Transpolitics by Max Strassfeld, Associate Professor of Religion at the University of South California and this semester's Gerhard Kasper Fellow. During his time at the Academy, Max has been working on a project called Disciplining Life. It dives into life cycle rituals like birth, puberty, marriage, and death, challenging the idea that these rituals are all about individuals or that reproduction is the ultimate goal of life. Max's work is pushing back against scholarship that usually ties these rituals to rabbinic literature and links classical Jewish sources with a focus on hetero-reproductive life. So Max is just questioning everything many of us thought we knew about life, literature, reproduction. So settle in for a thought-provoking evening and get your questions ready already. A few words about the fellowship this evening. The Gerhard Kasper Fellowship exists thanks to the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and in particular, the late Martin Gregorian, who served as its president from 1997 until he passed in 2021. Martin was also a trustee of the American Academy in Berlin. The fellowship is named after Gerhard Kasper, who many of you in this room may have known. He was president of the American Academy not once, but twice. He was also a longtime trustee of the Academy, and he was a former president of Stanford University. In every role that Gerhard took on, he championed academic excellence, rigorous research, and the humanities. So we're honored to have Professor Max Strassfeld as the Gerhard Kasper Fellow this semester. His impressive career aligns perfectly with the fellowship's pillars. And we're also thrilled to have Max's family with us this semester as well. Carlin and Sammy, I hope you're having a wonderful time here. I will introduce tonight's introducer. And then you will hear from Max, you'll hear a discussion from both of them, and then you will have a chance also to ask questions. So we're delighted, in addition, to have Zohar Weiman-Kelman here tonight to introduce Max K. Strassfeld and moderate the Q&A. Zohar is a distinguished scholar in Jewish studies, queer theory, and Yiddish literature. They hold a PhD in comparative literature from UC Berkeley, completed a postdoc in women and gender studies at the University of Toronto, and are currently an associate professor at the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Zohar's work, similar to Max's, bridges Jewish cultural studies and queer theory, focusing on marginalized voices in Jewish history and literature. Zohar is the author of Queer Expectations, a genealogy of Jewish women's poetry, published in 2018, which offers a queer feminist reading of Jewish women's poetry, challenging traditional interpretations of Jewish texts and history. Zohar has held fellowships at the Cat Center at the University of Toronto, as well as Pennsylvania, and they're also a postdoctoral teaching fellow at the University of Haifa. And Max and Zohar are friends, have been friends for a long time. They are generational friends, as I just learned. Their families are friends, and I think they have other family friends in the room with us tonight as well. As I briefly mentioned, Max's lecture will last about 35 minutes, after which he'll be joined on stage by Zohar for a discussion. After that, it will be open to you in the audience in person, as well as those joining us on the live stream for Q&A. So do start getting your questions ready. At that time, if you're in the room, do raise your hand if you want to ask a question. And online, you can type it into the appropriate question box. And as always, please do make sure that your question is a question. And by the end, it might be nice to have some, lighthearted questions. Is that what we said, Max, to come up with some levity at the end? In any case, Max, I give it over to you. Thank you so much.
Hi, so I prepared to say it was an honor to be here, but now I can also say it's an absolute pleasure to be with you all and to introduce the work of my good friend, colleague, and co-conspirator, Max K. Strassfeld. So just for the details, in case you haven't gotten to know him or Googled him, Max is an associate professor in religious studies at the University of Southern California. He earned his BA in comparative literature from Brown University and a PhD in religious studies from Stanford University. Max's first book, Trans Talmud, Androgynes and Eunuchs in Rabbinic Literature, explores eunuchs and androgynes did I say that wrong? I probably said that wrong. In Jewish law, pairing classical Jewish texts with intertext autobiography, transgender studies, and theories of queer temporality. We will soon be hearing a lot more about this and about his current project that Anna beautifully described. Before that, I did also want to say something about the note of the timing of tonight's event as we approach the culmination of the 10 days of awe. That's the 10 days between Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur. And in Hebrew, we call these the Yamim Noraim, which anachronistically sort of echoes the word Norah. In modern Hebrew also is not just awe, but horror. And these are horrible, horrible days. So being here in this beautiful, calm space right now, it's a blessing and a privilege at the same time as it also encapsulates so much past pain and maybe also future healing promise. This focus in my comments on time is not coincidental. This is indeed also key to so much of Max's intellectual project. As Max writes, time is a gendered affair for the rabbis. And Max deploys this intersection of temporality and sex gender as a powerful tool that he uses for past and present alike. This takes on very different meanings in each layer that Max engages. It allows him to explore the lifespan of individual bodies, past, present, the regulation of time and bodies as a collective endeavor in rabbinic Judaism, the consolidation of modern categories of sex, gender in the historical moment of the emergence of Sexualwissenschaft, the so burning debates of trans rights we are steeped in today worldwide, and finally, my favorite, the queer historical impulse that allows for the meeting of these multiple layers, embracing anachronism while recognizing difference. This is clearly a very timely project. Max's talk tonight, Traditional Jewish Literature and Trans Politics, will introduce us to just some of these fascinating materials.
All right. So thank you for coming tonight, for schlepping to Wannsee. Thank you to Zoe for the lovely introduction. Thank you to the American Academy staff who make it possible for us to focus on our research. For the donors who make the Gerhard Kasper Fellowship possible, and to all the other fellows, because I've already learned so much from you. So, oops, pardon, this is yours. Here's what I want to do tonight in 33-ish minutes. I'm going to briefly situate us in time and space for those who are unfamiliar with rabbinic literature. I'm going to introduce the categories I study and how I study them. And then I'll look at two short texts with you all, one from rabbinic literature in late antiquity and one contemporary anti-trans law from the US. So what is rabbinic literature on one foot? Rabbinic literature originates in roughly the first 6 centuries of the Common Era. This body of literature is the product of a movement called the Rabbinic Movement, which is spread between Roman Palestine in the west and the Sasanian Empire in the east. I'm oversimplifying, but that's briefly the when and where we are. The Talmud is the most famous composition to come out of the rabbinic movement. Perhaps you've heard of it. It's not a genre of writing that we're familiar with. So we call the halachic text, often we call that law in English. It's not a great translation. It doesn't really correspond to what we tend to think of with that English word law. It also contains medical advice, stories about the sages, ritual prohibitions, all kinds of things that we wouldn't necessarily also put in the genre of law. Biblical interpretation also. The rabbinic source we'll look at today is actually from an earlier layer of rabbinic literature. So it comes before the Talmud. There's a debate which compilation it actually comes from. I'll cite it from the Tosefta, but if anyone really wants to nerd out on the manuscript tradition, you should feel free to ask me in the Q&A. But it comes from an earlier layer, and we'll look at that text in a minute. I also want to introduce you to the figures that I'm going to be referring to as androgynes and eunuchs in English. And as you listen, particularly if you're not familiar with this literature, you don't need to hold on to all the labels and words and categories and their specifics per se. What I want you at least to walk away with an impression of is the broad range of bodies that the rabbis are talking about. So that's what I would like you to hold on to. So the rabbis inherit their category of eunuch from the Hebrew Bible. The word in Hebrew is saris. There's also debate about how often that means eunuch in the Hebrew Bible. Anyone who wants to know about that, feel free to ask me later. But the rabbis also develop that category. So there is two kinds of eunuchs in rabbinic literature. There's the eunuch that we would think of as a eunuch when we hear that English word. There are people who are men that make changes to their bodies later in life. That's how the rabbis would think about them, that category. That's what we tend to associate with the word eunuch in English. However, for the rabbis, there are also people born with bodily differences that mean they're not going to be able to reproduce. Those are also eunuchs for the rabbis. Both men and women can be born as eunuchs. Okay? So notice, first of all, that's already broader. The eunuch is an imperfect translation in English. That's already broader than what we think of with that word. There are also figures that I'm calling androgynes in English. We'll look at two of those. Androgynos is clearly a loan word for those of you who speak ancient Greek. I'm looking in the back because I know. So it's clearly a loan word from the Greek. You can see on the slide also a picture of a very famous Roman statue, Sleeping Hermaphroditus. There's a number of copies spread in different museums. That's because these were popular topics more broadly in Greco-Roman culture. It's not just the rabbis who are talking about eunuchs and androgynes. The cultures around them were as well. The first androgynos, the first androgyne, we'll see shortly in the text that we'll study together. The scholars think that this figure had two sets of genitalia. And you'll see why when we study the text. There's not really a description of this androgynos, but that's what scholars have concluded. The other androgyne is a tumtum, and we simply don't have a word that matches that in English altogether. The tumtum is described differently in different places, but their defining characteristic is it's unclear what their sex gender is. They perhaps have one, but we don't know. So when I talk about eunuchs and androgynes in rabbinic literature, these are some of the figures that I'm talking about. It's shorthand for a number of different categories that really don't translate well. I also want us to notice that none of these map particularly well on contemporary categories of intersex or trans. Those are categories that have their own logics, come out of their own historical moments. So if we think about, for a minute, the term intersex, for example, that's an umbrella term that assumes that lots of different kinds of sex variations somehow are connected, right? That's a particular way of thinking about sex. When we talk about the saris, the eunuch, that's also an umbrella term. incorporates different kinds of bodies. But notice that for the rabbis, people may be born with bodily differences. That's something we might tend to associate more with intersex today. Or people can make changes to their bodies later in life. That's something we might tend to associate with some particular forms of trans embodiment today, certainly not all. And all of those folks would be considered eunuchs. So it doesn't map well with our taxonomies either. Instead of identifying historical trans figures, then I talk about transing in my work. So let me tell you very briefly what I mean by transing. And I'll read this passage that's on the slide, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I want you to attend to in the passage. Oh, I didn't originate the term. It's used by Joanne Meyerowitz in a talk, and then Susan Stryker, Paisley Carra, and Lisa Jean Moore developed it in 2008. Quote, transing is a practice that assembles gender into contingent structures of association with other aspects of bodily being, and that allows for reassembly. Transing can function as a disciplinary tool when the stigma associated with lack or loss of gender status threatens social intelligibility. It can also function as an escape vector, a line of flight, or pathway towards liberation. End quote. So in this definition, they're emphasizing the way different aspects of bodies are being combined to create meaning, and that they're contingent. In other words, there's no stable ahistorical body. Rather, the various qualities of our bodies can be assembled and reassembled to make meaning in different times and places. Notice also that transing means two opposite things for these authors: discipline and a path towards liberation. And I would say that most of my work sits exactly at this apex of the point between discipline and the path towards liberation. And you'll see a little bit of that tension in my talk. So what do I mean when I talk about transing as a disciplinary strategy? I'll explain. One of the ways I use transing is to think about how certain bodies are made to bear the weight of failures. So for example, lots of bodies experience hormonal shifts in their lives. Lots of different kinds of people may even take supplementary hormones, but only some of those are labeled a sex change and regulated differently in medicine, right? Another example, when we're thinking about eunuchs, anyone who has struggled to have a child can tell you that reproduction, even when you have all the necessary components to hand, is not guaranteed. Jewish texts historically have extensively discussed infertility. So when we get to the category of eunuchs who can't reproduce, I step back to ask a very deliberately naive question. What is it that makes their procreative failures unique exactly? Right? If all sorts of people can be born without the capacity to reproduce, why are eunuch procreative failures of a different caliber? In other words, who's made to bear the weight of different kinds of failures? And asking those types of deliberately naive questions, even when I can give sometimes a formal answer from the literature, can be quite helpful to point out some of the logics in the sources. My interest in disciplining bodies comes out of the political pushback that's happening right now in the US in relation to trans people. So for the rest of our time now, I want to read closely one rabbinic source, and then I'm going to take us to the anti-trans law. The most programmatic text on the androgyne comes from early rabbinic literature and starts with a topic statement. In the case of the androgyne, there are ways that he is equivalent to men. There are ways that he is equivalent to women. There are ways that he is equivalent to both men and women, And there are ways in which he is not equivalent to either men or women. And the rest of this text is then organized under these 4 headings. Here are the ways the androgyne functions legally like men do, like women do, etc. I want to note first that the translation of this very simple topic sentence is actually a little bit fraught. But in part, it's made difficult by the androcentrism of Hebrew. So the default grammar is masculine, which is why you see it translated in the masculine there. That's accurate. But it forecloses some of the questions that the text, I think, is trying to ask before we can even really fully ask them to translate it like that. So I've translated it in multiple different ways, including with Z and here with kind of de novo pronouns throughout the years. Nothing is terribly satisfying. This acknowledges androcentrism, but I want to just notice the tension even in just this translation. Okay, so the list begins with how the androgynos, the androgyne, functions as a man. And here again, if you're not familiar with Jewish law, you don't have to hold on to all the details. I want you to get a sense of how this list is working as a whole. So the androgyne becomes ritually impure through seminal emissions, like men do. He has to uphold commandments that generally women are excluded from. He must marry but not be married, noseh avalon nisa for those with the Hebrew, which means that he can initiate a marriage contract with a woman, but he cannot be married, a phrase that's in the passive, like women are to a man. So the active passive grammar there is standing in for gender roles. You would have a hard time finding a more concise statement of androcentrism in rabbinic marriage law than those 6 words. But it's in this section kind of fitting the androgyne in and exploring how the androgyne functions like a man in regards to Jewish law. The list continues to spell out the ways in which the androgyne is like women. He becomes ritually impure through menstruation, like women do. He's disqualified from being a legal witness, like women are. Notice that the androgyne is equivalent to women, both through doing the things that women are supposed to do and from observing the stringencies that exclude women in Jewish law. A law that states that androgynes and women don't function as legal witnesses only needs to be in a context where somebody else, i.e. men, do, right? So this category is interesting because it's also about the androgyne being exempted from certain commandments. Well, this is a matter of prosaic discussion about how the androgyne fits into these various laws. It also raises some deeper questions. For the rabbis, having more legal obligations is a good thing. It's positive. So when the rabbis are comparing the androgyne to men, to women, here's how they function like men and women, they're giving them more obligations, more things to do. They're incorporating them into Jewish law, essentially. There may be some practical difficulties in actually enacting this. Namely, for example, that the laws of seclusion say that the androgyne can't be alone with either men or women that they are not married to. Not sure how that would work. But there is, on the whole, an effort to weave the androgyne into Jewish law, into rabbinic law. If the strategy of the list is to incorporate the androgyne, there's a coda to the text. And the coda is doing something quite different. Rabbi Yossi disagrees, the text said. The androgyne is unique, and the sages could not decide about him whether he is a man or she is a woman. Rabbi Yossi is disagreeing with the whole approach that came before. He's assuming that for the androgyne to participate fully in Jewish law, they would have had to choose, is the androgyne a woman or is the androgyne a man? Because the sages instead say, here's how they function as a man, here's how they function as a woman. In other words, they don't choose. The androgyne must be excluded completely from law. This final statement by Rabbi Yossi tries to undo the careful work of fitting the androgyne into rabbinic law. It's also extraordinary. It sacrifices the illusion that the law can address all situations in life. It's not saying the androgyne doesn't exist. It's saying the androgyne exists and we can't address it in our legal system. So at first reading, the list that comes before and the ending are diametrically opposed to each other. One's inclusive, one's exclusive. While it's true that for the androgyne, it matters, the effects of these approaches are quite different. In fact, both the list and the ending are colluding. They share a vision of the role of gender in law. For the list, gender is important as a central organizing principle, even being like a man, like a woman, all organized around gender, even like being like both and being like neither, all organized around gender. For the ending, on the other hand, gender is so essential that the androgyne must be excluded. This text is often read as reflecting gender in Jewish law. Instead, I would argue, they're both agreeing on the centrality of gender. They're not just reflecting. This is one key moment where they're articulating, not the only, but one key moment where they're articulating, saying gender is central to how we do rabbinic law. From a contemporary Jewish trans perspective, there are all sorts of problems with this source. And yet, trans, queer, intersex Jews have been coming to this text. And after years of studying this and talking with my communities, I think it's really that in the face of cultures that deny their existence at times, this text treats the presence of some kind of sex and gender diversity as prosaic, as a part of the world, as a part of life. In fact, I think we could even go further than that. I believe that the rabbis understood androgynes to be created by God. The phrase, the androgyne is unique, or a creation unto themselves, it's a little hard to translate there. That phrase, bria, in the Hebrew, comes from the same root as that first verb in Genesis, creation. And it is often in early rabbinic literature used to refer to God's creations. Not always, but I make the argument that it happens enough that I think it's a reference. It might even be a reference specifically to rabbinic interpretations of the creation story in Genesis that interpret that Genesis 1:27 verse, God created the human in the divine image, creating them male and female, the end of that verse, right? The rabbis have interpreted that verse as saying that the first human that was created, therefore, must have been an androgyne. What human is both singular and plural, as the grammar shows us. What human is both male and female, an androgyne. So Adam, in that interpretation, which is found in a couple of different places in rabbinic literature, was an androgyne. We're going to come back to Genesis and this verse shortly, but I want to turn now to contemporary debates over sex and gender in law to look at a really different reception history of Genesis. We have seen in the build-up to the current election a full-blown attack on trans rights in the US. The targeting of trans and queer youth is so extensive that historian Jules Gill Peterson has argued that this is the most consolidated political attack on queer and trans youth in US history. The graphic on the slide, I thought I'd bring for folks that aren't familiar. It's from the Anti-Trans Bill Tracker. It's online, and it's a map of the US colored in by state. And if you clicked, you would find all the different information about the different bills. I'll briefly summarize for you the kind of overarching message that they're trying to give us with this. So in 2024, this year, 384 anti-trans bills at the state and national levels have been proposed. If you add the bills that were carried over from last year, that's how you get to 658, making it the fifth consecutive year that breaks the record on how many anti-trans bills are being introduced. This year, 44 laws have already been passed and signed into law. They range in effect. There are bathroom bills that regulate who can use what kinds of restrooms. There are bills that control what educators can teach in their classrooms. Bills that regulate sports, single-sex sports. The Supreme Court, which is back in session this week, is set to rule on a case on the constitutionality of Tennessee's bans on gender-affirming medicine for youth. So we're going to see some more important decisions. And half the states in the US have some version of the ban on medical care for trans youth. The good news is that most of the original laws that were proposed were way more stringent, and in the process of the back and forth negotiation, the versions that passed in most states are more lenient, but it's not good that we're seeing this kind of trend. The marked increase in the introduction of anti-trans bills doesn't actually originate in this election cycle. It really comes during the Obama presidency, not because he's a fan of any of this, quite the contrary, but rather, I think we can think of it as a broader conservative strategy as part of a conservative white Christian evangelical nationalist agenda in the US that gained traction in the backlash to Obama, accelerated under Trump, but was by no means initiated by him. In that sense, it's not accidental that they started with bathrooms, the so-called bathroom bills. Just consider the long white supremacist, ableist, sexist history in the US of managing bathrooms. And if you look at the campaigns that they ran supporting these bills, it's really quite clear. For now, I want to focus us on the language of one of these earlier sets of laws that pertains to religious freedom. This is currently the law in the state of Mississippi. In general, the subset of anti-trans religious freedom laws argue that if someone discriminates against a trans person, but they can say that it's because of a sincerely held religious belief, that it's legal. Right? That's the kind of gist of those laws. So let's look at the language. It's defining here, what are the protected religious beliefs that you can act on, discriminate, and you shouldn't be held accountable for? The first is that marriage is or should be recognized as the union of one man and one woman. The second, that sexual relations are properly reserved to such a marriage. So basically a commitment to heterosexual marriage and sex within marriage. But I want us to notice a couple of aspects of the language that are quite interesting here. Notice in that first clause, marriage is or should be, right? Acknowledges that the current political reality does not reflect this. Gay marriage, of course, is one way, right? There's a gap between the ideal and the reality built into the language itself. The language, similarly, sex should be properly reserved to marriage, gestures also towards a gap, that there's sex being improperly practiced, right? In other words, in this section, the beliefs that it's protecting are counterfactual. Heterosexual marriage and monogamy are in need of protection because they're not the reality around. These clauses protect the belief in a different social order. Okay? The third clause functions differently. So I'll read the language here. Male, parentheses, man or female woman refer to an individual's immutable biological sex as objectively determined by anatomy and genetics at time of birth. Third clause basically says, protects the belief that sex and gender identity are assigned at birth, cannot be changed. There are some obvious problems. Genetic testing, for example, we don't generally do that for all newborns, so not quite clear what they're referring to there. The language also assumes that anatomy and genetics always align, which intersex activists have taken issue with. some of these laws change in subsequent versions of the bill in other states when they try to acknowledge, I think, some of these difficulties. Notice also that the terms for sex and gender are collapsed with those parentheses, male and man, right? Serves as the claim that both sex and gender identity are biological and empirical. I want us to notice something else that I think is even more odd about this language. The language of anatomy and genetics brings in science and medicine into a bill designed to protect religious belief. In other words, they're saying it is a protected religious belief that medicine establishes sex and gender at birth. From the perspective of an apparent divide between the secular, scientific, and religious, this leads to a certain incoherence. Is it a scientific belief that sex is immutable? Is it a religious hypothesis that science establishes sex? Even as scholars in religious studies have persuasively argued that secularism in the US is not, in fact, secular. This explicit invocation of science and medicine in a religious freedom bill should make us pause, but the effect is clear. When the law entwines the scientific and the theological, it naturalizes a divinely ordained gender binary. In other words, science and religion do not believe in transsexuals. In consequence, as the rest of the bill describes, discrimination, and particularly refusing services to people, is transformed. It's not discrimination. It's the instantiation of a protected religious belief that trans people are impossible. It manifests into reality a gender binary. I want us to notice one small point about the difference between A and B and C, the first two clauses and the third. They don't function in the same way. Those first two clauses are counterfactual, right? They say is or should be. The world doesn't actually reflect this. They're counterfactual. Trans people, however, are not treated in the same way. Gay marriage shouldn't exist. Marriage should be heterosexual. Trans people don't exist. The distinction between should not and do not is small, but it's also vast. Here we might think of activist and actress Laverne Cox's statement that trans women of color are told don't exist. And we'll think a little more about this as well. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with Genesis? Because I promised you we would come back to the creation story in Genesis. Despite the fact that the language never explicitly mentions Genesis, this definition of sex is in fact theological. Mother Jones did a great job doing an investigative report proving that the legal language originates with the Alliance Defending Freedom, which I'll call ADF, which hopefully will not confuse the Germans in the room. Alliance Defending Freedom is a Christian legal advocacy organization, an evangelical Christian advocacy organization. It's classified as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. An earlier version of this same language is found in proposed school policies that were sent to school boards saying, here's the bathroom policy that you should adopt around who gets to use the bathroom, what our definition of sex gender is. And if any of you are sued as a result of adopting this policy in your school, we'll defend you pro bono. So we can actually see the evolution of this language. And then they turn around and craft some of these religious freedom bills, and they hand them to legislatures to try and get them to adopt these in their various states. In other words, the ADF is helping to write particular evangelical theologies into these debates over trans bodies. When we look at some of the statements of faith of the ADF, we see explicitly that they're citing Genesis 1:27. That verse that we have up here again reads, God created the human in the divine image. The ADF interprets that verse, particularly the part said, creating them, male and female, as saying that binary sex and gender is ordained by God and in the Bible. Hence, trans people do not exist, right? We see that theologically written into the language of that bill. Notice, however, that is precisely the same verse that the rabbis use in other contexts to imagine the first human is an androgyne. What person is both male and female, right? That's the same verse they're using to imagine the impossibility of transness in the ADF. My point is not actually that the ADF are interpreting the verse wrong, nor is my point that the rabbis are going to liberate us. Both of these position sex and gender as central to law and as a site of regulating people and bodies. My point is actually just much more basic. We are seeing now in the US political claims that there is a timeless Judeo-Christian investment in sex gender binary, that it goes all the way back to the Hebrew Bible, and that Genesis is the origin of this idea. These claims are at best simplistic and at worst deliberately obfuscating a long history of debate over what these verses mean, both in Christian history and in Jewish history. If we were just to look at the past 100-ish years of US history, we see the creation stories used in debates from women's suffrage to gay marriage. So we see these same verses coming up, speaking on many different sides of the political spectrum to these issues. I live in a country that is fighting to impose the idea that gender and sex are binary. And it's imposing it through law, bureaucracy, in our educational systems. One of the pleasures, then, of studying rabbinic literature and these sources for me is that those concepts that we take for granted right now, those ways of organizing the world that can sometimes seem natural, come out of a particular time and place. In other words, the rabbis organize sex and gender differently. If that is true, then it cannot also be true that the gender binary is the only natural choice. Sex and gender were not always this way. And perhaps then the corollary is true. It may not always have to be this way in the future. Thank you. I forgot very quickly to do the image description of what's on this slide. So there's a tweet by Christina Pushaw, which I didn't get to talk about. If someone's interested, you can ask me. Quentin Bell is on the top there. He's one of the co-founders of Nights and Orchids. He used to be the executive director, which is an organization by and for Black, queer, and trans folks doing some really important organizing across the South. The person in the middle is Skylar Morrison, who is a trans teen who went to the Arizona State Legislature to testify about when they were considering some laws, anti-trans laws. And then there's the Alliance Defending Freedom.
All right. Now we get to have a conversation. We all get to have a conversation, an opportunity that feels especially precious being here. I think the opportunity to encounter this queer and trans knowledge and this Jewish knowledge in this space in Berlin is not something that we can take for granted, not in this time and not across history, which makes me think of the one part of your project that you didn't talk about so much, which is the sexology piece. And I asked that because Max is secretly tracking the footsteps of Magnus Hirschfeld while he's here. And we've had some exciting archival escapades together already.
I have a show and tell, actually, I remembered to bring. Yeah.
You can do it and I'll keep going.
Okay. I'm not a 20th century historian, obviously. I mean, I'm not trained in contemporary law either, but I seem to talk about things that maybe I have no business talking about. There are experts about Magnus Hirschfeld in this room. I'm very happy that some of you were able to come. So the essay is really actually a personal essay. I got interested because Magnus Hirschfeld, Jewish sexologist, fled and died in exile in 1935. And he's known for a number of things. He's a complicated figure, but one of the things he's known for is early advocacy for trans folks. So if you were to go to the really lovely Magnus Hirschfeld archives, which I highly recommend all of you make appointments to go do, you can see, for example, Gerd Katter's travel pass that the German authorities issued for him, the police issued for him. You can correct me if I'm getting things wrong. That allowed him to dress as a man and travel freely while doing it. And there were something like 7 passes issued, there were a few in the Weimar Republic before, obviously, the situation changed. So some very early trans history and some important queer and Jewish history. It centers around the figure of Magnus Hirschfeld, but it's also an essay about the fact that my family it was German. My grandfather left Germany in 1935. I'm the descendant of the small part of my family that made it out. So it's also an essay both about a kind of desire for history and also about the accidents of history. All the ways that contingency goes into building an archive, surviving difficult political moments, and the contingency of me being here now in this moment back in Germany. So I'll pass this around. This is a photo of Hirschfeld and Dora Richter, who's very famous early trans woman. I don't know that we've identified this figure yet on the right. I don't know. I'm looking at, I don't think this figure has been identified. One of the things I'm scheming on is reenacting some of these old photos with Zoe, among other people, while we're in Berlin. This one we know is probably taken in Tiergarten because it's near where the Institute was. We have already a photographer, but if anyone has access to a closet of
your great-grandmother's closet
from the 1920s and 30s, or works at a theater, and I would swear to dry clean it afterwards, please reach out. And I'll pass around the show and tell.
Yeah, no, and I think the work with Hirschfeld's archive is so interesting just because it represents, on the one level, like such a rupture in continuity of knowledge production. The fact that we were so much farther in terms of queer knowledge and parallel Jewish knowledge, and that to a large extent, so much of this knowledge was lost. And what does it mean to kind of retrace steps that we've been missing? And that, connects me to a larger part of your project in general about just how you're using trans history with all its complications.
Yeah. I mean, the part of one of the things I see in my community is a real desire for trans ancestors and trans history. And it's often slightly deflating for people when I say, I don't exactly call these figures in the Talmud trans precisely, or people will often ask me, do you have any other evidence for people? Like, do we have, a memoir, a diary or something? And do I really wish that we had a memoir or a diary? What I have is the rabbis mostly talking about these figures to a large extent. There's a few exceptions, in which I'm happy. If anyone wants to be pointed in those directions, I can show you those. it's a tension in my work, right, that I don't actually have the perspective of androgynes and eunuchs at all. So one of the things I do in my book is play with that a little bit. I took one of the stories that is deeply problematic, that I am also quite in love with, and I rewrote it from the perspective of androgynes, playfully, not historically, not pretending to be history, just a little vignette. And I had an artist, a trans-Jewish artist, collaborate with me to illustrate it. And it was more to mark the gap than anything else, right? To mark the absence. And to note that kind of queer desire, that trans desire for history.
Yeah. That makes me think also of, something else that you're doing by looking at what the rabbis said, is this question of, are they describing a reality? Are they prescribing a reality? And this tension in law I live with, a trans-legal scholar, Ido Katri, who's here, who writes about how the law tries to mitigate the damages and discrimination that it itself is doing and creating. So how do you understand that tension?
Yeah, so when I talk to my students about this, because my students often, I'll have them to generate a definition of law, and they'll say, it's about rights, it's about what you're supposed to do, and it's about what happens if you don't do it, generally. And then I say to them, actually, let's see if this works here. Is jaywalking illegal in Germany?
That's crossing the street.
Crossing the street. Yeah. Okay. So show of hands. How many of you have jaywalked, crossed the street against the light? Right. So if I put this statute up here that governs jaywalking and said, okay, where does it say that 99% of us will have broken this particular law? And then I lead the students through a discussion of all the other ways that this does not match our reality. Doesn't anywhere say that this is a particular statute that we're having a national debate over in terms of racialized policing and the effects, like who's held accountable for breaking this law, right? In all sorts of ways, legal texts, they have an influence on reality, they shape reality, they certainly purport to have a relationship with what people are doing in real life. But it's actually, historically, I think, quite complicated to figure out what that relationship really is.
I have more questions, but we have other opportunities to talk to each other. And I think this is an especially exciting moment to open this up, because I think some of you are encountering either the rabbinical side or the trans side, maybe so up close for the first time. So please, yeah.
First of all, thank you so much, Max. But I have a question about translation and word order that goes to the American side of your presentation. And I'm trying to remember the King James translation of that passage from Genesis, but I think it's male and female created he them, which is, in a sense, syntactically and almost in meaning different from he created them male and female. It feels a bit more categorical to me. And given how important the King James Bible is to American culture and presumably to American law, I'm just curious, how much of a commitment is it when you translate which words you use and which word order you use?
Yeah, that's one of the things I love doing with my students, is putting up a verse and putting up 6 different translations and picking apart a little bit what the differences might mean, what we could make of them, how we might understand them differently than in those contexts. And certainly the Hebrew is a little bit funny in that verse. That's what the rabbis are responding to. The first part of the verse is in the singular. Suddenly we're in the plural. There's repetition. We've already had a verse about being created in the image of God. So why do we need to say it twice for the rabbis? You have to think about a kind of a sacred hermeneutics. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is extraneous. There's a reason. If it's repetitive, there's a reason. So each little piece is open for interpretation in that sense. And certain translations then carry an outsized weight of how we understand that. Even when I'll say to my students, actually, it's, I speak Hebrew, I know the Hebrew. It's not exactly explicitly that. That's a fine interpretation. but here's what the words literally say, but we're attached to these histories of meaning. And if you look historically, when they tried to translate the Bible into other languages, often there's an outrage, right? Or even they try to update a translation. So they've done the Greek translation and now they've done a new one or a new Latin translation. You have communities rejecting it because they're so attached to the exact words as they already understood them. Thank you.
Are you going to pass do I pick? No, please. Please.
I'd like to build on Michael's question. I was wondering about the context of that one verse. What comes before? What comes after? Does the context shed any, I hate to say light, but on the possible meanings, plural?
Always what you do when you're looking at the meaning of a verse is look before and after. And you look also for other places in the corpus. Where is that word used somewhere else? So I can get a flavor of what it could mean. You gather all of the instances together and you sort of sift through. And, I'm, in a sense, I'm not so interested in deciding what the precise meaning is, partially because I'm not a biblicist myself, but also because I think there's a number of different ways to understand it, to make sense of the redundancies in the verse. And I'm interested in that plurality. I want that to stand. Jacqueline Hidalgo, who's a scholar who wrote a beautiful book on Revelations, for those of you who do Christian history, Christian literature, talks about scripturalization, this kind of process of making meaning out of texts in context with place and community. She's talking about Latinx history in particular, and all the complicated ways we make and interact with texts. And I think that in the end, that multivocality, that history, that it's meant different things in itself is so powerful. But yeah, there's a lot to play with because of the repetition of the verse before, that it already has said people were created in the image of God. So now it's saying it again. Why do you need to say it twice, right?
Yeah, right behind.
Thank you, Max, for this evening. I just want to know if the idea or meaning of the word gender has changed through the centuries, because I can see that a rabbi considers the physical body as gender in a social context. And
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not sure that the rabbis understand sex and gender to be separate. In other words, they're talking about bodily attributes, which sometimes go with the category of sex in the contemporary. They're also talking about various legal roles, which we might tend to associate more with gender, and all of it is braided together. I don't think that they have sex gender. I talk about it as sex gender in the book. I don't think it's quite separated for them. But also, if we were trying to, we're quite careful when we do history of sexuality stuff not to assume that our categories today are the same as our categories are back then. It feels more recent that we've been trying to be careful about using that term gender across time. And for the rabbis, there's all kinds of things that go into the bucket we might think of as gender that we would never put in there today, like priestly status and impurity laws and body temperature. That's a gendered medical sign in Greco-Roman. So there's just a different set of issues and values that mean that the term gender, we can talk about it, but you have to sort of mark that gap because it doesn't quite mean what we mean today when we use that term. Thank you.
Rufus?
Thank you. It was really Wonderful, and wonderful to hear you. It seems to me that I'm hearing that you're kind of constructing this talk as a kind of a Jewish view or a possible understanding of a Jewish view, which is much more nuanced and interesting than the kind of legalistic position that we're in today, and this backlash that we're feeling today in the United States. So I'm wondering if this is all about reception history, right? How the rabbis are interpreting this tradition, the range, and how Christian fundamentalists today in a certain stream is understanding it and pushing it politically. I'm wondering, in your journeys and travels through all this material, if you have found other reception histories that also complicate the situation. Bosniak Christian don't exist anymore. Other traditions that might have understood the kind of nuances in a different way than would be evangelical Christians, or even extra biblical communities of people, Zoroastrian, Central Asian, that constructed or understood gender differently in a way that we could learn from. Just wondering, because it might be, to me, it's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, the ancient world is amazing also. I mean, really amazing and really weird in a wonderful way. So one of the stories that circulates in rabbinic literature is an androgyne I didn't actually talk about. So I'm going to tell you about this androgyne, and you tell me what it sounds like for those of you who recognize it. So they talk about an androgyne who they're kind of two bodies glued back to back with two faces. They're called the du partsuf, the two face, right? Facing in other directions. One body masculine, one body feminine, glued back to back. Who's heard that story before? Yeah, where's it come from?
Plato, yeah.
Symposium. Yeah, right? So this is a story, he doesn't invent this story, but those of you who are familiar with Plato's Symposium, or the Hedwig and the Angry Inch retelling of Plato's Symposium, right, where they have the graphic that shows it. This is a story that Plato didn't invent. It was widely circulating through this time period. And there are statues that date back even, I think, like 8,000 BCE. I mean, we're talking very, very old, of figures with two heads that they think maybe were these kind of divine ancestor androgyne figures, right? Shai Secunda, who's an Iranologist, has written about versions of this story in early Zoroastrian literature too that look different. We have Empedocles as a Greek writer. So we have various versions, all slightly different, but all playing with the idea that either binary gender was not the first creation, maybe it's a later stage of creation, or that there's just more options, a more weird version of how to understand how we come to be. And you can think a little bit of creation stories as explanations for how we come to be, right?
Go ahead. You.
So I was very curious in the passage that you had on the slide about transing and about kind of simultaneously it being a disciplinary tool as well as a liberatory tool. And I was curious to hear you reflect back on that in the light of your research and the presentation that you gave, because I felt like that set us up for
some liberation.
Yeah, well, that as well as it set us up. It prepared us for the talk that you gave, and yet I'm curious to hear you reflect back on that particular articulation in the light of your own research.
Yeah. Yeah, this was it's a kind of bummer of a talk in this format. Sometimes when I speak for a little longer, I'll end with telling that story. I'll read my retold version of the story to try and say, like, we inherit what we inherit and what we do with it doesn't have to be what they intended for us to do with it, right? We can allow for things to exceed their creator's intentions. And that, I think, I find hope in those kind of moments. I find hope just in denaturalizing the things they're trying to say are natural through history. I find a little bit of that trajectory towards liberation. But in all honesty, it's a pretty difficult moment. I recently wrote an essay where, and some amount of despair, asked, what is the point of trans history now? What is the point of what we're doing in this particular political moment when I'm not going to convince any of the opponents who are writing these bills that what they're doing is wrong, or that they need to be more, allow for the possibility of things to have multiple meanings? What is the point in this moment?
You're building an archive.
Nell said, I'm building an archive. Oh, I'm so glad. I've been looking for somebody to answer that. I asked the question, but I don't answer it. Yeah, maybe I just have one piece and other people will pick up and do other things.
God willing.
God willing. Yeah.
Like Hirschfeld. Yeah.
Like Hirschfeld. Yeah. Yeah, that is a little bit why I'm so focused on touching that past to try and see what else it could be.
Go ahead, Jake.
Thank you so much. That was really, really inspiring and fantastic. I was thinking about how these ideas, these rabbinical ideas, were actually applied in concrete situations. And I had one particular situation in mind. There was a letter to the editor in the Vorwärts in 1936. Maybe you've seen it, about they had just been starting to publish about the first trans well-known figures. I think it was an athlete that they had published about, and then someone wrote the letter to the editor saying, "In my shtetl, we had a trans person, and they got married, and but it was really interesting because at the beginning of the story, before this person transitioned in the shtetl in Ukraine." Which I would love to find more about if you could find it.
If you find, send it to me.
I can send you the article. It's been translated. But they said they kept on going to the rabbi, and the rabbi said, "God will help. God will help." And eventually they would go to a professor in Odessa, and the professor helps this person transition. But I was wondering, in rabbis who are confronted with these situations and actual situations, were the texts that you showed us being applied somehow, or is there any sort of rabbinical literature about how they were applied when they felt someone gender non-conforming or intersex or whatever we call them person showed up at their door and asked for advice or help?
Yeah, so originally I had this idea I was going to follow up all of the reception history of these texts, which was bananas. I can't believe they approved my dissertation proposal. That didn't end up happening, but I will say that because these are texts, the kind of interesting thing, one of the interesting things about sacred texts is that we keep going back, we keep touching them. And so they have all these like accrued layers of touch through the time. And we see folks, for example, who are in medical ethics today, trying to decide about the ethics of intersex surgeries, which are still, despite the fact that the standards of care changed in 2013 in the US, are still sometimes being practiced, this performing surgeries on infants to correct their sex. So we see Jewish ethicists using texts like about the Eilonit and the eunuchs and androgynes to try and think through what's a Jewish ethical approach to this question. So very much, right, because these are whatever they did in the past, however the correspondence was to realia, they get applied in various ways. And of course, people come to different answers. Some of those answers are more, I would say, positive, and some are less. There's also, what's his name in Israel? Orthodox. He wouldn't sell me the book. I can't even get it. I have to send my father at some point when he's there, because he won't. It's Dora Tapuchot. It's like anyways. There's contemporary folks that are either writing, not responsive, but just writing their opinions, talking about trans issues in relation to these texts. And their scholars, Ronit Irshai, is working on this question, looking at these texts and how they treat trans folks. And she's kind of arguing, okay, it's not positive. The title is like Generation of Perversions, basically in English, of the book, but that he's trying in little ways to create more space. So he says that like the surgeon's actually responsible for the transgression of sterilizing someone if they perform a surgery on someone, like a gender-affirming surgery. The person who undergoes it is not responsible, meaning if you go to a non-Jewish surgeon, no harm, no foul, right?
Mhm.
There's nobody to hold accountable. So in very subtle ways, even though it's orthodox and quite conservative, within his framework, he's trying to create some space. Even there. Yeah, Moshe?
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you very much for the talk. And I would like to ask a question about violence. In other ancient culture of the same period, if I'm not mistaken, we have cases of involuntary castration,
Yeah.
creation of sarisim,
Yeah.
of androgynes, as an involuntary enslaved entity. And
Yeah.
I wonder to what degree this is also the case in the Jewish culture to which you refer.
Yeah, we don't see explicitly that referred to in the same way. It's quite clear, not as much. It's quite clear in other cultures that sometimes castration was not voluntary. It was considered a punishment. We also see, by the way, other kinds of violence. So the probably did not happen very often, historians think, but there was child exposures practiced in Rome, where if an abnormal birth happened, they would expose the child to sort of reset the natural order. In other words, the infant was left to die. So they have these lists, they're called prodigy lists in English. I'm not sure why exactly, but we know that some of the infants that were exposed were androgynes, not from Jewish literature, but so we know there's violence, right? That's some of the traces we have of that past are violent. We also have, though, other kinds of traces. So we have Matthew 19:12. Anyone know your Christian Bible, which talks about there are eunuchs that are essentially born, come out of their mother like that. There are eunuchs who become eunuchs later in life, and there's eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, right? And we have Sabellianism. We have other kinds of religious movements where it's clearly an exalted choice, and both of those things are true. So one of the reasons why I'm quite hesitant to call any of these figures early trans folks, right, is that sometimes it was absolutely not volitional. It was a punishment. It was a humiliation, right? And that is not how I understand. That's not a trans ancestry that I want to reclaim in that way. Time. Do I find? I mean, there's Isaiah. Yes. Do I find involuntary castration in Jewish sources? I'm trying to think. I'm looking at other people who know Jewish sources. I'm trying to think. I can't think of something off the top of my head that mandates that. And it's complicated because we don't also know whether saris in the Tanakh also even always meant someone who was castrated. So there's like all these layers of that. You definitely have negative text. So the eunuch in Isaiah, right, who's bemoaning I won't have any offspring. I'm a withered tree. He uses that imagery, that tree imagery that happens in Isaiah, right? And then God says, I'm going to give you Yad Vashem. I'll give you something to carry on your name if you keep my Sabbath and you do the other things. But it's clearly like, the eunuch in that story is not thinking of themselves in a positive way. So we have texts that portray this negatively, for sure.
We have time for one last question there. Ido.
I'm gonna maybe connect and take you to contemporary U.S. law, and so the Tennessee bill now with the U.S. Supreme Court, the SB1, and the other gender affirming care, they have this. They all exclude intersex interventions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they permit intersex intervention and they prohibit gender affirming sex, and they do this through this like, I don't know the wording, but a very similar kind of phrasing of biological sex.
Yeah.
In those terms. So I'm wondering, what's your reading of this like dynamic that's happening?
Yeah, and years ago, I forget, I was at the Philly Trans Health Conference, and I asked the lawyers from Land Legal who were there presenting about how they were fighting certain cases. I said, can you talk about intersex folks and the difficulties with defining sex in that way? And she said, we've used that strategy, and then what happens is they write a carve out so that intersex folks can, with the definitions of sex, which bathroom you should do, all that, they'll write a carve out for intersex people, but leave the piece about trans intact. So it hasn't been successful in challenging the whole law. But yeah, it's not, the irony is not lost that they're willing to continue to correct sex non-consensually before a child can voice what they would like, despite the case with MC, that there was a landmark case that was brought, which eventually settled out of court, where the grounds for the case was that a child was being adopted. The state, while in care of the state, decided to undergo treatment for this 2-year-old and had them perform the surgery to assign them a clear sex. The child grew up, said he was a boy, and in the process of correcting and assigning him female, then they had made changes to his body, right? And the adoptive parents sued and were trying really to get the statute overturned. That's what the practice overturned. They really wanted it to stop. They wanted there to be financial penalties to quell the practice. They ended up not totally being successful in that, but there was a financial payout. But there they were, it hinged on the fact that they had sterilized this child, that was the claim that they could make, that he had been involuntarily sterilized. So we're going to see all of these issues. I mean, you know better than I, but I think we're going to keep seeing all of these issues as they keep trying to refine the language. You can track from the early bills now from 5 years ago how they've tried to refine the language to try and work against some of the challenges that they had.
Well, I was hoping we were going to end on a more optimistic note.
I'm sorry.
But I hear there's coffee. So voy a esperar para, do we have time for a second question?
What's your favorite color?
That's my kid.
Yeah,
I really like brown and blue together.
that's a non-binary answer.
Thank you for coming. We're going to sit down now.